Bueno, voy a empezar. So, I am going to talk specifically about what I see as the key challenges and also the key opportunities that Paraguay faces. So I'm going to start with with a joke, with the joke. So the joke goes as follows: there's a person who sees that his neighbor's house is burning down. He runs out, sees his neighbor. The house is on flames. The neighbor is cutting his grass. He shouts to the neighbor and he says, look, your house is burning. Your house is burning. Why are you mowing? Why are you cutting your grass? Your house is burning. The neighbor looks at him and says, I've already tried to call the fire department. Nobody picks up the phone. Nothing I can do, but cutting the grass is something that I know how to do. Okay. So I'm going to start off with that joke because I think it's important to focus on the house that's burning down and not on cutting the grass. And hopefully I'll be clear as I go. And can I turn on my camera now? Todavía no puedo. Está bien. So the way I want to start is that I want to say what I think, where I see Paraguay is now. Some of this was already covered by the presentation of the minister in the last panel. I guess I see things a little bit differently. So a couple of points that I want to make. Clearly, there's been rapid growth since the 2003 crisis. When I look at the data, I look at the evidence, I see that it's coming, that the growth that has taken place is coming mostly from three things. Number one is what I call and this is well known to everybody in the Paraguay, which is the revolution in soybeans. It's the same revolution that has swept through southern Brazil. And the gains, you see this very clearly. You see this very clearly in the export data. You see this very clearly in terms of the data on what the land is being used for. And if you want to think about where the gains are coming from, most of the gains, I think of it as being one-time gains. They're one-time gains from the switch from low margin crops to high margin crops. And also a big part of the gain has come from the use of more land, and a big part of that comes from deforestation. Now, once you realize that, you understand that it's not likely to yield further growth. Now, there are going to be ups and downs due to changes in the world price of soybeans, but structurally, it's not going to lead to more growth. The second piece that has happened is that there's been a rapid growth of, this is something that the minister also covered, of manufacturing maquiladoras. Mostly, my sense is that it's mostly Brazilian. It's still relatively small. It's still relatively small. And I want to just note as a piece of caution here that the country that has really embraced the maquiladora model the most is Mexico, and it has the advantage of being of having access to the largest market in the world, which is the U.S. You see the effect of the maquiladoras in terms of the tremendous growth of its export. You see the effect of the Mexican maquiladoras in almost every single indicator, except for the most important one, which is economic growth and wages. So I think that it's the biggest mystery about Mexico, but I just want to just note that as the caution of where exactly this model can go. And I think that the biggest I want to say that the biggest example of this, which is what's happened in Mexico in the last 30 years, is not very optimistic. The third piece that I see as important, and this is not something that was brought up by the minister, but you see it very clearly in the data, is that there's been a big expansion of services in Paraguay. You see this very clearly in terms of employment. Primarily three things: finance, construction, retailing. And when I try to understand where this has come from, I point to two sources. There could be some that I'm missing, but the first one that I can see is that it's some of the growth is coming from a macroeconomic instability in Argentina. So part of it has been coming from investments by Argentinian investors seeking safety. Now, this may continue. This may continue, but maybe not. And the second thing I want to say is that some of these activities may also, so some of these services may also reflect illicit activities, drugs, money laundering, and these are not exact activities that you want to encourage. So I think it's important to realize that the growth that Paraguay has had for the last 20 or so years may be coming to an end. And it's important to think about the next 20 years. Where's growth going to come from in the next 20 years? So another way to put it is to look forward and not backwards. To think about the house that's burning down and not about cutting the grass, which is useful, but it's not where the returns are. So but at the same time, I think it's important to understand, at least from my perspective, that there are also tremendous opportunities, that there are also huge opportunities, but we got to realize what these opportunities are and what needs to be done in order to take advantage of these opportunities. And so I will focus then on three things, on what I see as the combination of the three biggest challenges, and there also are opportunities. So the way I want to start is what I think is really not that big of an issue, which is the issue of debt. So I will put myself out on limb and I would say that the debt is important, but when I look at where Paraguay is in terms of debt, it could turn out to be a problem. But right now, given where things are, it seems to me the equivalent of cutting your grass. So when I look at these numbers, when the debt has gone up, obviously, as everybody knows, you're doing the COVID crisis for good reasons, and Paraguay was able to tap international capital markets. But when I look at these ratios, and when I look at least a number of the forecasts, they do seem to be relatively sustainable. I mean, certainly very far away from ratios like 90%, 100%. Those are the levels for which I think that one should really begin to worry. So I'm going to say that in terms of where I would spend my time, what I would think about, you've got to take care of the debt, but I don't think it's the biggest issue. So what do I think is the combination of the biggest issues and the biggest opportunities? Number one, everybody who is in this room now, who's in the room in Paraguay, knows that the situation right now is that organized crime has made major inroads into the country. So, I mean, I don't need to repeat the news from the last few weeks. And it's absolutely clear, I think, to everybody that if this is not something that is dealt with, then everything else that we talk about is moot. That is, nothing else. There's nothing else that you can do if you don't, if this issue is not solved. And the fact that it's made major inroads into Paraguay already, which I think everybody understands, I think makes the solution very, very difficult. And what I thought it would be helpful for me to do is to just talk a little bit about the experiences of other countries. And I'll talk about Mexico, and I'll talk about the experience of Colombia. I'm not sure whether Marcela is still online, but I'll be interested in her view. Let me just start by saying that whenever there's organized crime, the typical answer is that, what we got to do is that we've got to put more police. We got to put more police resources. We've got to put in more judicial resources. We've got to crack down on crime. And you see this discussion in Paraguay in the last few weeks. What I want to say, and this is what we have learned from a lot of the other countries that have gone through this, that organized crime is actually very, very different from what I'm going to call low-level crime, okay? And this is the reason why. That, think about the name. Organized crime is organized, okay? What do I mean by that? That whatever they do, the killings, the terrible terrible killings that we have seen, they're strategic, they're calculated, and they're, I'm going to say, rational. And what we also know from a lot of terrible experiences around the world, that organized crime, generally, they prefer to have peace. And the reason that they prefer to have peace is because it's only with peace that they can do what they really want to do. What does this mean? What we learned from the experiences of lots of other countries is that let me be clear. The first best thing is to have no organized crime at all. But that's not the situation that we are faced with. The situation that we are faced with is, once it is present, what do we do? And I think the best that we have learned is that you get into this terrible situation when you have this horrible trade-off between peace and organized gangs that are weak. That is, and the evidence we have is that you can't have both. Okay, and we can talk a lot more about this, but let me just give you the evidence of two countries that have gone through this. So the first picture I want to point to you. So this is the evidence from Mexico. Okay, so what was it that happened in Mexico? What happened in Mexico? So you see, in this graph that I'm showing you, in one of the figures I'm showing you the homicide rate in the city of in all of Mexico, and the second graph is the homicide rate in the city on the U.S. border, Ciudad Juarez. What is it that happened? What you see is that a new Mexican president comes in 2006. This is Felipe Calderón. His number one agenda is to crack down on organized crime. He sent in the Mexican Navy, sent in the Mexican he sent in the Mexican Army. 2006. What happened after he sent in this massive infusion of police and military resources to fight Mexican organized crime? What used to be an organized crime in which there were basically three big cartels that dominated the drug trade, it basically fractured into several hundred of these gangs. And what you see in the homicide rate is basically this fracturing, the fracturing, and the homicide rate is coming from the battle between the different gangs to try to basically establish themselves as the dominant gang. So what you see then is a massive increase in in the homicide rate, and then particularly you see these terrible numbers in Ciudad Juarez that in 2010 it was 10 times more dangerous than say Baghdad was. What happened in 2010, 2011 was that President Calderon basically gave up on his war, withdrew his military forces, and what you saw then was a consolidation of the gangs, which made the gangs stronger, but at the same time, what you saw was the peace. So this is basically the situation that Mexico is in now. Let me just give you one more piece of evidence. I know that many people in Paraguay talk about, Paraguay is becoming like Colombia. So I think it's useful to actually find out what happened in Colombia. So what you see here is the homicide rate in what used to be one of the most dangerous cities in the world, Medellin. And you see that starting in the early 1990s, the crime rate fell like a rock. And when you try to look at what has happened, what happened, and it is something that everybody in Medellin will tell you, was that there was basically an agreement between the different gangs in Medellin. They call it the Pacto de Fusil, which is basically there was an agreement to basically share the profits and to share the rents. Each gang basically stuck to their own neighborhoods, not to fight each other. So the consequence then is that the equilibrium that you have now in Medellin is that you have very strong gangs, but you basically have peace. And that, so far, the evidence we have is that once organized crime gets in, that this is basically the trade-off that you are faced with. So, I completely understand that it's a terrible situation to be in, but this is, I think, the first thing that we've got to think about, and we've got to find what we can live with before we talk about we can talk about anything else in the Paraguay. Okay, so that is number one. The second thing I want to talk about, which I think is important, and I think it's missed in a lot of the discussions about growth, a lot of the discussion, is that what we've got to understand is the potential for transformation comes from people doing things, from people starting companies, people coming up with ideas, people creating companies, people hiring people and growing their companies. And then all of the evidence that we have is that most of these activities take place in certain types of urban areas. That is another way of saying this, is that all the evidence we have from around the world is that this kind of process takes place in basically dense urban ecosystems. And when I look at where Asunción is now, I see the potential, the promise, the huge promise for this taking place. It hasn't really happened yet, but I see the potential for this transformation taking place, I think, with just a number of minimal investments. So what do you need? The first thing that you need is that you need to have scale. That is, you need to have a dense urban area. When I think about where Asunción is now, it is there. That is one of the things that everybody in that room, in the room knows, is that Greater Asunción has grown tremendously, grown by leaps and bounds when I look at the numbers over the last 30 years, it's more than tripled in size. Not in Asunción proper, mostly in the suburbs. Okay, so but then what's the issue? That the issue is that the potential is there. Greater Asunción has a scale and the potential, but the other thing that you need is that you also need the infrastructure for this transformation to take place. the two key bits of infrastructure that you need? Well, there are two things. You need the infrastructure to have innovation and startups. Okay, that is, what do I think is present in the greater Asunción? It doesn't lack startups. So this was the discussion in the previous panel. There's a tremendous number of startups in Paraguay that it has a very young population, which is the evidence we have from all over the world that it's primarily the young people that drive this process. The other piece of evidence that we have from around the world is that it's the combination of what goes on in the universities and what goes on in the urban areas. So just think about the potential of what I'm gonna let me just throw out an idea of creating an innovation hub that is around the National University and in San Lorenzo. So think about something like that as being part of that first bit of infrastructure. The second bit of infrastructure, which I think is the main piece that is missing, is that you also need an infrastructure for the companies to grow. That is, you see companies emerging, but then if they emerge and they don't have the infrastructure they need in order to grow, then they will always remain the kind of companies that Marcela Eslava talked about. Okay, and this is the key piece which I think is missing. That is, Greater Asunción has a scale, but we all know that basically it's grown, but the public services are basically not there. Okay, and I just want to just highlight three things. That is, one of the main things that you need in order for a company to grow is that you need to get workers, and workers need to get to jobs. Okay, so what you need is that you need to have an efficient public transportation. And again, when I think about where Asunción is now, this is a piece that the Asunción is basically 90% of the way there. That is, it's a relatively cheap system. It's not a particularly pleasant system, I guess I would say, but it's cheap, and it goes almost everywhere that you want to go. So this is the thing where I see that with just a couple of small investments, making changes in the way that the public bus system works, I think there would be just huge, tremendous gains from doing that. The second thing is, I know that the Método Bus failed, but it is the right idea. So I think it is a time to revisit that idea and to learn from the mistake from 4 or 5 years ago, and then to think about to do it correctly this time. And the last thing I want to say, and again, this is I think something that everybody who lives in Asunción knows, is that whenever it rains, the flooding on the streets is just terrible. It's just terrible, and you see this in the data that it's a major obstacle in terms of getting to work. And so it's a major obstacle. So this is, I think that it's well understood that it's something that just needs to be solved. So priority number 2, okay, that is, take advantage of the potential that is there in terms of greater, that is there already in greater Asunción. Number 3, and this is where I will end. It's really important, and here I'm just going to repeat what has been in the public discussion in Paraguay for 30, 40 years, as long as I can remember. Focus the public sector. As everybody knows, there's a widespread cynicism about what the public sector does, okay? But I do think that what we've seen during the pandemic gives us some optimistic signs. Like, I'll point to one thing. I was really impressed by the cash transfer program that was put in place. I will say that I thought it was an incredibly innovative system. So I'm talking about the system called Productores. right? And it didn't suffer from the typical public spending program. So for those of you in the room that played a part in rolling out this program, I must congratulate you. The second thing that we saw, so I want to say that I think it's important to sort of build on that success, okay, and to think about what next can we do? What next can we do that is going to have a major impact on the citizens and also a major impact on the future growth of Paraguay in the next 20 years? Unfortunately, the other thing that we saw during COVID, during the pandemic in Paraguay, was that the public health system, and this is something that we know, is just dysfunctional. That is, we've seen lots of stories about people who don't have the money to pay for the private hospitals. They borrow huge amounts of money whenever a member of the family gets sick with COVID, because they're not taken care of by the public health system. And this is one thing that I think, if I were to pick one part of the Paraguayan public sector to have a radical rethink, it would be this one. It would be this one. And it's useful to just think about what is the role of the public sector in health. You need the public sector to collect revenues. I think that's clear. You need the public sector to provide health, to provide health insurance. But the question is, why do we need the public sector to deliver the services? Why do we need the public
Profesor,
sector?
tiene un minuto
Sí,
para terminar, por
yeah,
favor. Gracias.
yeah. I will finish in 1 minute. And the way I want to think about it is that what we know when we look at any other service that we have is that any effective system needs to have competition. And that's the key thing that the public sector health system does not have. And I want to give you one example to think about what Colombia did in the early 1990s. That is, before the early 1990s, they had a very Paraguayan type of system where they collected the taxes, and it was a public hospital that delivered the services. What they did in the early 1990s is that they changed to the following system, where what the public sector did is that they collect taxes, and they also put in place a system of subsidies for low-income people, but then they open up the delivery to privately owned providers. So what you see for anybody that has gone to Colombia, you see that basically these privately owned providers are the main providers of health. And in large urban areas, it is a very competitive system. That is, if there's a particular hospital in which you have to wait a long line, you switch and you go somewhere else. Okay, so that's just one example of what you can do. Bueno, ya.